Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
Well, folks, I have anticipated, over a year, to have this second conversation with Theo Forde-Stiegler, because we kind of promised each other that when the book was at the state of being done, with always more possibilities to add to it, that we would reflect on our collaborative practice, but also project how things that we used to do are no longer necessary, but new things are coming up, like marketing and selling the book, and maybe other projects. So this is that moment here in June of 2022. And before we go very far into two-way conversation, Theo, I want to thank you so much for being such a wonderful collaborator.
Well, right back at you, Dave. I feel that it was really an honor and a blessing in many ways to get to work on this. I don't think it was an easy task, but I think for the most part, I think that you and I were able to avoid any of sort of the doldrums of repetitive and boring and just, the have to of maybe an editing process. I think because we were able to leverage some of the technology that's now available to do it collaboratively, to do it together. And yes, because we, I think, resonate in some ways. There's another one of my musical metaphors. Mm-hmm. Because we resonate in some ways, it was really a joyful process and an interesting and intriguing one. And I hope that you feel the same way, that we both learned with and from one another in this process, and from Peter in not insignificant ways. So thank you, and thank you right back at you.
Well, folks, that's it. We don't have any more. You can't do any better than that. But I think we can, because when you and I looked at how we could introduce the authors, the standard way, with a paragraph or two, the bios, you made a great suggestion, which was, well, why don't you voice the introduction as if you're introducing Peter and Peter's introducing you, Dave. And I put Peter's voice in to do that. But it was a really important moment to be able to say what Peter had always wanted to say, which is practice matters. Absolutely. It's a way of being. And it could not have happened, Dave, if you hadn't agreed back in the late part of 2018 to help me. And so I had that feeling of, if I could add a line or two to Peter's words, it would say, thank you for, again, like we just did, thank you for collaborating. But the other thing that I did is I added a line or two where Peter said, well, and also we should thank Theo for being such a great collaborator. And you nixed that. That's the only thing I think you've cut out in the entire book. You said, oh, there's a better way to do that in another place, another time. But no, it was both humble and also it was quite an insight. And I wondered, can you remember what you were thinking when you nixed having that transition to thanking you?
Well, I think that there's so the initial impetus, I think, was to say, do we really need to write another book cover biography for Peter Vaill? I think those are available. I think that, a quick Google search will give people many an insight as to what Peter has said and wrote.
That's right.
And who he was, and his accolades and his achievements, and the impact of his practice. Mm-hmm. I do think that if Peter was still here, there is a chance that some version of this work would exist without having yours and my fingerprints is not the right word. What are they? Practice intentions without having our part and piece to where the book has now been published on the My Library platform. He probably would have found a way to make it happen. It was important to him. It was a passion project. But I do think that the way that it worked out is exactly in line with the thinking that he talks about in the book. He approached you and it became a collaborative effort.
Yeah. And
you then approached Steve and myself, and as you had heard of My Library, and it became a collaborative effort between the two of us. Mm-hmm. And I think in many ways that speaks to the kind of practice Peter had in mind as he describes it in his conjectures. Mm-hmm. So it made more sense to me in the framing that we have found worked for the book, where you are giving context, where you are setting up, where you are. In my mind, it's a little bit like a stage play. I could imagine, maybe an abbreviated version of this as a one-man play, but it needs two men because there is one, or women, or whoever might be called to act this out. But, it's a conversation. It's become a conversation.
Yeah.
And so I thought that it made sense to bring that same conversational framing to the author biographies, to introducing the two of you. And so it made sense that one of you would introduce the other. And it didn't feel like it fit to have a third character introduced into the play at that point. In a theatrical production, you don't suddenly have the producer, the person that, or the script writer is not suddenly appearing on stage as an actor. They remain in the background for good reason, right? And so I think that was quite appropriate. To have my supports of this project identified elsewhere.
I think I'll push that analogy of a stage play a bit further. When you and I agreed with Peter's family and with Sander, his beloved, that we would do our very best to make what was produced Peter's thoughts on practice, his conjectures on practice, and that he would have a lead. And I wanted it that way, and I don't know how the family felt about it, but when we started scripting it, putting my voice in to introduce each of Peter's conjectures and looking very carefully at Peter's wording, where a little editing here and there could make it easier for the reader, but basically it's, starring Peter Vaill, co-starring Dave Fearon. And I liked that very much. But when I wrote what Peter said about me, he complained right away. He said, Dave he's always acting like he's still my student, and, somewhat insubordinate and all the rest. But see, that's truth. That's my truth. There were moments when it would have been kind of fun to let the ego fly and push Peter aside and say, oh, and by the way, he doesn't know crap about this one. Let me really tell you what it means. And I didn't want to. And so that's important. And a little bit more, when I gave the author introduction a heading, I said an abiding collaboration. And that does bring you back in, because that word abiding, it still feels very strong for me that here we are, still working on the book, still abiding by our agreement, long before any kind of paper was written that described our relationship. When we were just having that first conversation all the way to now, we're looking close to 2 years at least. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at the wrinkles that I didn't have before. My forehead was... You got gray, David. I got gray. I got white. I got bags under my eyes that you could pack and carry away as suitcases. But actually, the irony of the abiding collaboration you and I have had is that I've had a hell of a lot of fun. And I think, if anything, it's kept me young, because I had retired for 5 years before you and I met. And I look forward to every Friday or every Monday that we were having our updates. I look forward to seeing when something would pop up in Google Docs where you had made your suggestions in editorial whatever, took out the red pen, slash everything.
Editorial whatever. So I'll have to quote you in that in my when I describe to people. So what do you do? I'll do the
I do the whatever. But that's the main way of saying anything else that I can't think of in the moment. But the thing is that it kept my spirits up. And now I want to ask you the same question as a practitioner of many things, but particularly as a practitioner of the producer editor of this particular work. How did you feel each week? Oh God, not another. Dave is such a knothead.
Well, can you pause the recording so I can tell you how I really feel? No.
Yeah, it's paused. Go ahead.
It was no. I honestly, this is for me. Really has been a unique opportunity in the sense that I got to wrestle with content that was impactful, but I also got to work in. For me, this was the first time that I've had this sort of close one-on-one collaboration in my role as an editor. I've done a lot of editorial work that was with multiple authors. That was typically shorter amounts of content, if you will. And so to have this sort of really drawn out process that included early on figuring out, what is the format? I recall you and I looking at some of the early edits where Peter had intended to take his words and sort of establish you two as co-authors, right? To make certain statements that were in what is now published in the I voice for Peter, to turn some of them into we. And I think we very quickly decided that because he had abandoned that and hadn't been able to push that through, but maybe a couple of conjectures, but that wasn't representative of where you were at in this collaboration.
That's right.
And honestly, I think it would have been much more difficult for you and I to do Peter's writing justice to attempt to, where would he have turned it? Where might he have kept it as an I statement? So I am much more comfortable in taking, and forgive me, but in much of our collaboration, I was reminded of, it's the two of us taking an unfinished symphony, an unfinished composition, and saying, what is the chord that Peter would have wanted here at the end of this section? And so I think we've been able to, with the format that we've created, do that in a way that honors his voice, that was that allowed us to really keep intact the vast majority of his words in terms of how they show up from where they were in the original manuscript, but to provide some context and maybe do the editorial whatevers in terms of, hey, let's make sure that the reader can really follow where Peter is going with this in making some minor adjustments to just improve clarity here or there. And so for me, that process of you and I establishing our own practice of how to both honor but also move forward this work to where we are now, able to present it to the world, was very much, as I said earlier, a joyful thing for me.
I think we'd have to look very, very far and wide to find a format like that resulted in. That my voice, Peter's voice, my voice, Peter's voice. I read a lot. I know you do, and my hunch is that this created something quite unique in a couple of ways, but particularly that way because my tone was different than Peter's tone, so it was more like a conversation. And I don't know if I've seen that done anymore. The other thing we talked about way from the beginning is, in terms of an unfinished symphony, here is one of the really thoughtful thought leaders in organization writ large, organization development, organization change, organization behavior, and also particularly within that leadership and managerial practice. So this would be like us opening up an old chest and finding an unfinished manuscript, which literally does exist on paper. I have it sitting over there. I think I should put it on a plinth or something. and looking at it and saying, what a find. Here are the last thoughts of one of our really powerfully influential people in a kind of an interesting way, because Peter was disabled for 20 years, could not get out and give the talks he loved to give, and the consulting and obviously the teaching and managerial leadership. So it was finding something that it took him 10 years laboriously through bouts of pain, exhaustion, everything else, to set down each of those conjectures until he got to the last one. And we have a kind of an inside joke, don't we, Theo, that we initially thought there would be 33.
Right.
And I was working from the last known digital version of what Peter had written. We sent it out in email attachments, and I remember looking. There's got to be a 33rd one, and we couldn't find it. So it was okay. So that 33rd one would have been what Peter had told me, as I recall toward the end, sort of a kickoff for what he would like to write in his next book. Can you believe this man's spirit? He was saying in the intro, he's saying, I'm going to tell you why I'd like to completely revitalize and reform managerial education, and that would have been one he would have loved to have written. And again, I would have stepped back and say, it's your thought, it's your voice. Right. I totally agree with you that it needs reform, and I'd love to help on that. But anyway, in the meantime, his other huge passion during those last 10 years, as you picked up on the videos talk that he gave to the Org Behavior Teaching Society, practice was something that meant something very deeply to him. And he said, and he lamented, I wish I had known how important it was back when I was doing all the things I could do, because I would do them even more differently. So we have quite a person here in this collection of his thought. And thank goodness you and I are his collaborators in this instance.
And I think it's quite telling that Peter did not. I assume he must have known that he had limited time.
Oh, he did.
And so it is. I think it is quite telling that Peter did not set out to say, here are the 20 lessons I learned about management, and that I shall leave behind. He went and he wrote 32 conjectures that he says, and if you're listening, you're welcome to get the book and check it out. But he says, here are my thoughts. It's an invitation. Peter is not saying, and here is how it is. And what I found is that such and such, and you must, and you shall. It is very much, here's my observation. Here's what I believe. Here is my insight that I want you to reflect on and see how it might resonate with you. Yeah. So here's that word, resonate again. But that word to me was really, that fact in and by itself, I think, was really an insight for me to say, here is somebody at the stature of one Peter Vaill, who certainly could have made claims as to here's what I found. And it is so that I probably would have looked at and said, well, if Peter Vaill says it is so, I ought to consider whether it might be. But he does hardly, not at all, do that in this final writing of his. And so that was in and by itself insightful for me to okay, so where do I take these things? How do they resonate with me? And how do I, as an editor, do an appropriate job to allow the reader to really get that invitation and have that opportunity to, in a way, continue that collaboration, right? And be the next in line to take what Peter, David, and Theo have put forth to say, okay, what is my opportunity to now engage my team, engage my colleagues, engage people in my family in how I instantiate my practice, or practices plural.
Yeah, you're right on, and my musical knowledge is quite limited compared to yours, but there's something about that popped into my head of the word symphony.
Mhm.
But it probably every symphony started out with the first stanza with a few notes, and then it builds and it builds and it builds, and then they start to think about other voices that could be brought in, other instruments and so forth, but when you take a symphony into a music hall with a full orchestra, and that baton strikes the first wave, it just hits everyone in the room, fills them totally and draws them in. And so the reverberation, if you will, of Peter's and your work on this is something that I'm hoping for. Yes, of course, we'd love to have sales, no question. But this subject, practice as a way of being, does matter. It's mattered to anyone and everyone I've had a conversation with during the writing of the book and now. Once you give them a little clue as to, hey, practice is you. Mm-hmm. This is what you've made of yourself by virtue of the choices you have made to commit yourself to a certain stream of results and to stay with it during changing circumstances. And at every instance possible, learn and grow. And they go, oh, yeah, I guess that is me. What next? Well, what next is become a keen observer of your own laboratory of life and proceed as a learner and a co-inquirer, meaning this is one of Peter's other themes, with anyone and everyone who will connect with you. So there's a symphonic effect that's starting to ripple out there. And pretty soon, in our wildest imagination, we've got hundreds of people having conversations about the nature of practice.
I certainly hope so. I gotta imagine that for any composer that I can think of that has inspired my own music making, that whatever the cantata might be that Bach might have written, or a symphony that Beethoven might have written, that it started with some motif, some theme, whether it was 4 or 8 measures, but there was a starting point there somewhere. Mm-hmm. And at least for those 2 gentlemen that I just mentioned, the intention tended to be who are then eventually the group of musicians that will perform this. And they a lot of times had the benefit of sometimes writing with, knowing who's going to play the second violin and the first cello and who's going to have the solo parts. And I got to imagine that in their practice of composing, that the collaborators mattered. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure there's other pieces where, I have to prepare this piece that I'm writing for the king wants something for the banquet. Mm-hmm. And so here is a standard formatting of as part of my practice that I can deliver. Mm-hmm. But I do hope that I think you and I have established that everyone has a practice and that everyone is intentional about it, because even somebody who would say, no, I'm going to ignore that practice, is making an intentional choice about it.
That's right.
In a way.
They demote it and they promote some other thing about which they love doing. And Peter, one of our conjectures, as you recall, is that it's not necessarily a singular practice. There are practices and practices that constitute us at a moment in time. Some, have back to music again, some have a more amplified status depending on the circumstances. Others then can chime in later when you realize that you need them. And this was Peter's lifestyle, actually. He was a runner, a sailor, a dean. There's so many things that Peter did and you and I have done that we can pull in a moment when we want to apply ourselves intellectually and spiritually to whatever the challenge may be. I want to swing over to one other thing. I mentioned that the book is an unusual way of getting 2 voices, mine and Peter's, mm-hmm. working in concert. That's for sure. But the other thing that is quite different goes to conjectures, saying Peter looked at digitization, or you and I had fun with that digitalization of work and life. And here we are sending out our book as a digital first book. And that is still evolving. So how did you drag this old guy into that?
You'll have to answer that one.
Whatever. You charm me.
Whatever made you agree to that, I need to know so I can leverage that for future conversations.
I wanted to be part of your and Steve and Carol's experiment, because I think that the collaborative change library that kicked off the My Library movement in your life was very intriguing, and it caught my imagination right away. But I wanted to be part of having the book that I worked on for Peter be also something that would be instrumental in your growth and learning, particularly you, because you had the principal seat, the first chair. And it could have been a huge flop. Not the book; it's going to sell like crazy. But just that venturing, because you were trying to pull me in my late 70s into understanding, and I keep saying, well, how are they going to be able to see the lettering how can they scroll, or how will this thing be put out there, and so that someone can take a section of the book and use it as your vision is. So how have I done in getting myself more understanding, and did I help you guys
absolutely
in my naivete?
Well, you use the word instrumental, so at the risk of having some of our listeners grow, and here he goes with this.
Here they go again. Yeah.
But I think you were willing to collaborate, and you were willing to allow me and allow us to show you what we were envisioning for the platform and for the My Library app, and how we would present the content. Mm-hmm. And you gave us feedback that was helpful in terms of, well, here's my academic practice of consuming content. Here is my academic practice of sharing content with students. Here's my personal practice of reading. And so it gave me an opportunity to, in some ways, make you a early adapter of our technology to see how it would resonate with you. Mm-hmm. And what we're building in giving people access to content through My Library, and some of the new technology that I'm excited about that is in our app that we're calling No Bits, which is interesting because you used that term in one of your own books as well. But the intention is to make it easy for people to access content in a manner that they can leverage it and use it. And a lot of times in our day and age, it just is no longer the most practical way of having something like this that I can give you or as a student to wrestle through.
You can stop a door with that, though. That's a big book.
Don't get me wrong. I love print books. I love nothing better than sitting on the porch with a good book and turning the pages and getting a coffee stain here or there in the process. But I think in terms of the content that we're focused on, and I think what Peter had in mind for his conjectures is that people would take it and wrestle with it. Yeah. And the intention to me is less, with my expectation for our readers is less that they, take it as a novel and front to back cover and, oh my goodness, I couldn't put it down, but rather that you could jump in at conjecture 22 and get some real value for whatever situation you're wrestling with in your personal practice, in your whatever it might be, professional practice at that time, and then be able to put it down and put it away and not look at it for a week or 3 months and then come back to some other piece. And I think that the way that we're presenting the book and the app certainly allows for that. And I think that it hopefully, again, to sort of maybe bring that back around, allows them then to, there's ways to share it then with somebody else, to say, hey, check out this one nugget here, this one piece that I found. I don't have to go and make you necessarily, hey, go out and buy this book at Barnes and Noble and go to page 327 and there's that paragraph. You could leverage social media. You could send it out via email and say, here's a link I want you to consider looking at. This is what I found. So I hope that can maybe enable and empower a little bit more of that collaborative co-practicing, co-inquiring that I believe Peter very much had in mind for how people would consume his thoughts. And not consume is not the right word. How people would leverage and develop and co-inquire further and use his thoughts. Yeah,
we said why this matters to you. There's a sense of this too that you just gave, that it was in a sense of wonderful coincidence that the way Peter built up this book over all those years was essentially somewhat random. I mean, it was organic. And he would have written 9 and he'd say, okay, for 10. And he'd go through his notes, I'm picturing, and he would strike a theme and he'd start writing a short essay for 10, a page or 2 or 3. And then he would go on until he got up to, we think, 33. But here's the point. Then one of the last things that he and I did when he was still able to sit up and work with a book, he said, let me write out a list of the conjectures under certain headings. So he was now taking something relatively random, not, one conjecture has to lead to the next, but saying, okay, how do they kind of group? And the outline that you used for the outline for the book is Peter's outline. I didn't rethink those things, but he had a sense of those. That's point A. That was what made that good. But the other piece, from the standpoint of how this book looks and you use it digitally, is that each of those conjectures, because they somewhat do stand alone, don't need a whole lot of preamble. You can click on it and read it quite quickly on your phone, on your iPad, on your computer, and absorb it. You'll be thinking about how to make some notes with it, and you don't put the book down, as you just said. You don't put it down. It's still on your phone. It's still on your iPad. You can access it anytime and come back. So that he had it segmented as if you had instructed him to do so when he was first writing the book. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I don't know if that is just that we got blessed by coincidence there, or lucky. If that was some other way that this was intentional in the universe, that this would come together in that way. Mm-hmm. But I do think that the opportunity for the users of this content, it's interesting that people, typically users is reserved for drugs and technology for some reason. But I'm saying users intentionally rather than readers, because I hope that people will use what Peter is putting forth here.
Yes,
there's an invitation to look at a section. I pulled it up here as I'm talking to you. So if I look at the subsections, and there is one about the nature of practice, one about the practitioner, one about curiosities of practice. Well, I'm curious. Let me see. Curiosities of practice. Mm-hmm. Practice is very interactive. Okay, and it's multilingual. Let me click on that one. So that's conjecture 17.
Yeah.
There is nothing stopping the user of this content, I guess reader first before you become a user of it, to start at conjecture 17 and look at what is Peter saying. Practice is linguistic and actually multilingual. Mm-hmm. And then you can look at the invitation that Peter makes and see if that resonates with your personal practice, if there's something there that you can leverage, use, and apply. And if you don't, I suggest that you might. If you don't, worst case scenario, then maybe 17 wasn't for you. But guess what? There is then 31 more.
Plenty more where that came from.
That you could look at. And I'd be shocked if we find a whole lot of people that can't find anything here that resonates with them.
Here's a conjecture about all of this. And maybe
a conjecture about the conjectures.
About what you said and about the formatting of the way this works. Peter wrote learning as a way of being,
right,
addressing adult learning. He made it very clear that working people tend to be the people he's talking to in regard to their learning. In other words, past school learners. Mm-hmm. If you look at the way you can use our book, my gut tells me it's the way adults learn. Adults for example, let's say I'm going to learn how to weld. Now, I suppose I could take a full course in welding. I could read every manual on welding. But actually what happens with adults is if I got to weld something, I'm going to learn just enough to make this first weld and not burn myself. So you learn a little and it works. And now you want to extend that to a little more of the practice of welding. And pretty soon, if you want to be, I have a good friend, Joe Seltzer, who welds metal sculptures now. And he probably started with his first weld. And so back to the conjecture, the book is an adult educational format. What do you think?
I think that I'm going to think of myself as an adult here for a moment.
All right.
And suggest that
think away.
Much of our learning is focused on practice, right? What in my practice what is practical right now? What do I need to learn in this moment to
what do I need to
do a better job at whatever, right? What do I need to do? And a lot of times we don't either make or choose to invest the time to grasp a thing as a whole if what we need is immediately in front of us. It's like I need these 3 steps.
Right.
And so I hope that the same way that people maybe use a Google search or a YouTube search to find some tutorial on welding, then they might consider that if I want to figure out how to improve my practice, there might be something here in one Peter Vaill together with Dave Fearon putting forth what they're conjecturing are important ways of thinking about that. And again, I think it's meaningful, or at least for me, it was resonant to say, this applies to my professional practice, this applies to my musical practice, this applies to my collaborative practice, this applies to how I work on Theo Forde-Stiegler becoming a better version of Theo Forde-Stiegler. Not all 32 identically in all of those different arenas that I look to be proficient and successful in. But there are elements of what Peter has conjectured that touch on all of those. And so I hope that the learning that I got to benefit from as an editor to really have to wrestle with it and figure out what are the right ways, the recommendations that I may make to Dave to add something here, or to let Peter stand alone there and make that point later, maybe in a different conjecture, that those things are in some ways an invitation to our readers and then users of this content to edit for themselves. Feel free to edit what Peter and David have put together here and say, here's how that works for me or doesn't work for me. One of the next iterations of our platform is going to include the ability to take notes and make highlights in your content, but also then to comment on a conjecture and say, here is something that resonated with me that you might want to share with other readers, other users, other practitioners down the road. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to, is once we have some of those tools in place for me to be able to read, for you and I to be able to read and reflect on how people are reacting and resonating with, for example, conjecture 27, practice is perceptual, perspectival. Where like, okay, Peter, tell me more, because I don't know what those big words mean.
See, he didn't use a lot of big words, but when he did, he had a real purpose for it. And one purpose was to have a struggle with it a little bit, to get it, to understand, to shift our mind from something conventional to a little less conventional. So that was a fun one that we had with that one. But I think that another point about this being an unfinished manuscript or an unfinished symphony, that's a good thing. And this is what I mean. It's unfinished because if the folks who bought the book originally, when we showed them just a partial sample of the book, so they bought on great faith in us, will be able to see someday, if they open their app, a new feature that our book has, because you can add it, I hope, digitally, rather than having.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's not.
So
it's not
you
like,
had asked me earlier what was my my entry into this, and why was I even seeking out this conversation with you? And let me maybe take a small step back to explore that a little bit, and saying that in my musical practice, I have great anxiety recording something and calling it complete and saying, here is my recording of this song.
Yeah.
Because I promise you that the next time I perform it, I tend, especially with my own music, but even with other people's music that I arrange, that I interpret, I find, oh, here's another nuance that maybe I would want to do this way. Or just today, because of the context of where I'm performing this piece of music, I want to, not play this verse or emphasize this other verse, or have a longer space for solo, or whatever that might be. Similarly, I think if I was the editor for this and it was a print first version of Peter's work, I would have great anxiety to like, okay, are we ready? Should we really, or should I do another passive proofreading, or should I maybe give it to somebody else first? Because once we've printed it and we've put 5,000 copies on various shelves somewhere,
done and done.
That's what it looks like. What this platform gives us an opportunity to, and you and I have done a little bit of this just last week, where we realized that in our process, the further down the road we travel together, we realized that some of the old mileposts that we came across, we now have a different appreciation for. So now we can go back and say, by the way, at mile marker 7, you ought to really pay attention that you could also turn left here and go to somewhere else.
That's right.
Maybe I'm stretching that particular travel metaphor a little bit too far, but we have an opportunity to, to cycle back to having our readers add their commentary and share insights and what resonates on a particular conjecture. We have an opportunity to, let's say, somebody that is more than 3 or 5 readers says, in conjecture 19, I have this issue where what is Peter saying here?
Yeah. And
maybe you and I thought, oh, that was perfectly clear. This came from the context over here. Well, now we can go in and we could add a footnote to provide that content, or we could make an edit to add something in your voice that, in conversation, maybe I would have said this thing to set that up for the reader a little bit more. So I look forward to this being let's go back and improve it constantly. No. But if we find that something was an error, if we find that something would benefit our future practitioners of this particular element by setting additional context, we can go and we can do that. And hopefully with that, the print version that I do think we want to honor Peter's intention with this to create at some point, but it can have gone through a couple of these iterations where, you and I and others look at it again, maybe from a slightly more distanced lens, now that we've gone through a very intense process of looking a lot of it closely.
We have definitely,
maybe you and I will benefit from
every word. Yeah. But you see, Peter, when we started the podcasting, when Peter was unable to continue writing, I remember him saying once we ended one of our recordings, as we will soon do here, he said, I really love our conversation, Dave, but how can we get any feedback? How can we hear if anyone's getting anything from this? And that's when I started looking at the toolkit around the podcasting, and there are some comment points in it, but rarely do people do that. What I learned. So, my point is that Peter loved feedback, good, bad, and indifferent. And that's why when he wrote the conjectures, there was always sort of a parenthetical invitation at the end of whatever he said. What do you think? This is what I think. What do you think? And you've heard some of the people I've had podcasts with, like Catherine Kaplan, Catherine Ross, Eric Dent, who were his former students, who would say the same thing. They would enter into conversations, and Peter was always as interested, surprisingly, in what they were doing and learning as we were of his accomplishments. So this is very consistent with the person, Peter Vaill, that we've talked a lot about all this time, and that's pretty wonderful. We will be taking these conjectures. Speaking of the podcast, I'll be doing a little bit about each one, sort of asking people to think, what do you think? And we'll be able to link it right to the conjecture, can't we, Theo?
Absolutely. Yep.
So they'll get a preview of the whole book. You can't just sit there and wait till I do all 32 and think you've got it and you don't have to pay for the book. Don't think that way, but I think it's just an extension of the symphony that we've started here. We just want to get it to more ears, more eyes, more thoughts, and get the reverbs, get the concert hall shaking and quaking.
And hopefully people will leave the concert hall and go home and pick up their own instrument of choice and see if maybe they can play a couple of the notes of the motifs and the themes that you and Peter have put forth here.
So as we began this, Theo, I thank you even more now that we've had this conversation, because I even more fully realize our collaboration, yours and mine, goes with one that I quoted yesterday when I was featuring a podcast with two very smart leadership educators. I picked a little line from the clip where Vanessa says, I said, well, what is it like to collaborate with Linda? And she said, well, I'll take this from the movies. Linda completes me. And Theo, you complete me.
I am grateful to have been able to find what it is that you bring to the table in this process and what I was able to bring to the table in that process, where we play different instruments and we can make different contributions to now this being something that is out in the world. And also I feel like I've gotten to know Peter just a little bit through this process. And that was quite a wonderful experience in and by itself. So, again, thank you right back at you.
We complete each other.
We just got to make sure our wives don't hear us talking too much now.
Oh, I know that.
Although they're probably like, go ahead, boys.
They know that when you and I are working, they can get other stuff done.
There you go. We don't get in their way at those times.
Oh, good. They're working on the book. Well, we've got more work to do ahead, but thanks again, and onward.
Yes, thank you. And to our listeners, please take this invitation to check out the links that will be provided to you wherever you're listening to this, to at least get a whiff, get a preview. There is actually various essays and writings available from both Peter and David on the My Library platform that are available completely free for you to access. And there are previews available for all and every one of the 32 conjectures and the other content in the On Practice book that David and I have been blessed to collaborate on together.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcast, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.